Hey guys, I'm Andrew with SHTF Honey Badger, and today I'm going to be talking about chest rigs versus plate carriers and SHTF. So with chest carriers and plate rigs, you have pros and cons to each of them, and that's something I'm going to outline a little bit here in this video. The first thing I'm going to bring up is cost. When you're looking at setting up a chest rig or at setting up a plate carrier, bar none, a chest rig is going to win out on that cost. A chest rig starts out at usually about $30 to $40 range depending on what you're looking at, and they can go up into the several $100 range. But even a good quality chest rig is going to typically run you $100 to $150. Plate carriers, on the other hand, are going to run you a lot more. The actual plate carriers themselves, for some very basic models, are going to start out around the $50 to $60 price range, and they go all the way up into the $600-700 range depending on what you're looking at and what brands you're getting for plate carriers. And that's just the carrier. The actual armor that you put in them, which would be, for example, level 4 plates like what I have in here, or level 3A soft armor like what's in this carrier here, are going to start typically in the about $300 range, bare minimum when you're starting to get into it, going up into the thousands of dollars. A side note as well is with these carriers, you can get them cheaper. You will see, a couple $100 for a carrier with armor. Those are typically going to be steel plates. Don't do that. If you're going to go the plate carrier route, at least step up and buy some level 4 ceramics, or buy, at least some level 3 polymer plates, but don't go with steel armor. Steel armor is going to drag you down. They weigh in excess of 10 pounds of plate for most of them, and they don't even offer that much more protection. Typically most steel plates are only rated at level 3, so they're not even going to stop some of the more common rounds you would still run across out there, such as the M855 ball ammo that you would see in AR-15s. So keep that in mind. If you're going to go with the armor, you do have to go with a little bit more expensive armor to really make it worth it. So with the plate carriers, you're probably at a bare minimum looking at about a $600 amount to get set up to where it's going to be functional, versus the chest rig to get it set up to where it's functional might be as little as $30 to $40. The next thing that we're going to talk about here is mobility. And when it comes to mobility, the chest rig again is probably going to be your winner in most situations. The chest rig, due to its design, is just going to hug the front of your body, and depending on the size, this one, for example, is a relatively larger chest rig. They may take up a good amount like this, but you do have smaller chest rigs that'll go about this size by this size, and those are only going to hold a couple AR magazines and maybe a radio and a tourniquet, but in some instances, that's all you need on you. A plate carrier, on the other hand, is going to encompass the entire upper torso. It's going to have a plate up here and a plate on the back, and those are bulky. Those are going to be uncomfortable if you're wearing them long term, and those are going to impede your mobility, especially when you're manipulating a weapon or you're trying to wear a backpack. So that's another thing to keep in mind if you're looking at stuff that's going to give you the most amount of mobility. Chest rig is going to win on that scenario as well. And then the big thing where the plate carrier is going to shine, though, is protection. When it comes to engaging with threats, having that protection on the plate carrier is a giant asset. Obviously, the goal when you're engaging, if you have to, is to A, not engage, but B, if you do have to engage and you do get hit, is to survive that hit. With a chest rig, it's offering you no protection, so even if you're hit square middle of the torso, where a plate, for example, would stop around, the chest rig's not going to do anything for it, and it's going to cause extensive damage to you. And especially you're dealing with SHTF scenarios, medical care is going to be very limited, if non-existent. So for example, if you're suffering from what may be a relatively treatable injury during normal times in SHTF, it could be a life-ending injury. So that's where having that armor is going to make a big difference. Now, while that armor, though, isn't going to be constantly reusable, for example, if you get hit in that armor is no longer going to be able to be reused. It's no longer going to offer full protection. It's definitely worth sacrificing that plate than it is sacrificing your life. So in that category, I would definitely give it to the plate carrier. And then the next thing is going to be modularity. This is an item that I would give to the plate carrier as well over the chest rig. Most chest rigs have relatively fixed pouches like what you see on this one here. You do see more and more modular chest rigs out there now, and they are getting more set up to switch relatively quickly between running one weapon system to another. But I would say plate carriers with the MOLLE systems that come on pretty much all of them default has a little bit more flexibility when it comes to the modularity. For example, you can see here, this plate carrier is set up completely to run handgun magazines. This over here is set up primarily to run rifle. This chest rig, on the other hand, with these fixed pouches, and especially in the lower end chest rigs, you see pretty much all of them have fixed pouches, really isn't going to be good for running handgun. Those magazines are going to get lost in these pouches. It'll work for running rifle though, and vice versa. If you were to find a chest rig that's set up and the cheaper value prices for handgun, you can't switch it over to running rifle. First, even the lowest end plate carriers are going to be MOLLE compatible, so you will be able to switch those around modularity wise pretty well. One thing I will throw out there with the plate carriers that I want to bounce back on real quick when it comes to that mobility, you can take the plates out of these and run them without plates. If, for example, you want to cut down on the weight for some reason and you're not too worried about protection. But the trade-off to that is these are still covering most of your body, which wintertime that's not so bad, but in the summer if you're out in the heat, it's going to still relatively cook you. It's going to act like insulation, keep a lot of that heat in. So, you know, that's one thing to keep in mind. You can run these without plates, but they're going to flop around and it's still going to keep the heat in, versus chest rig's going to be more ventilated because you're just running a harness on top of this chest rig. So in the mobility thing that I bounced back on, that's just another thing to keep in mind. Now, moving forward beyond that, kind of the last thing that I would bring up on is bugging out. And when you're bugging out, if you have to only use one of these two, I would go with the chest rig. Now, on the flip side, if you're bugging in, I would definitely go with the plate carrier. Bugging out, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, you're going to have that big advantage of throwing a backpack over and having more mobility because you're carrying less weight with the chest rig. On the other hand, if you're bugging in, say you're, for example, already at a cabin, a homestead, you're staying place in your neighborhood with your neighbors or with your family, the plate carrier is bar none the best option, simply for the fact it's giving you that extra protection, and that extra protection is a huge advantage if you do end up in an engagement. So keep that in mind. Now, overall, is one of these specifically a winner in the other when SHTF happens? I wouldn't say so. I would say it depends on your situation and on what your uses are going to be. So each of them has their own purpose. If you have the money, I would actually recommend looking into getting one of each. I personally, for example, have some plate carriers already set up, so I am looking into different options for chest rigs. This one right here isn't one of mine personally, it's a buddy's. So if you do have options for chest rigs, I'm always open to hear. Drop them down below in the comments. But overall, I would just look at the different options out there. I would decide what works for you and go with that. Otherwise, I just have this message for you. Stay safe, stay prepared, and thanks for tuning in.